Greetings. Time to look at the most visible branch of power in the American system, the presidency. The American presidency is often the place where public fantasy meets constitutional reality. We project all our hopes, frustrations, and fears onto this one office, even though it was never designed to do everything we now expect from it. It was Lyndon Johnson who said, quote, "The office is kind of like the old country boy found a hoochie coochie show at the carnival. Once he paid his dime and got inside the tent, it ain't exactly as it was advertised."
The Oval Office, Inauguration Day, Rose Garden signings, and Secret Service agents with dark sunglasses and cool wrist radios. For a moment, forget all of it. Toss out everything you know about the president. Now, start over. What would you do if you had to invent the president? That was the question facing the 55 men who got together in secret to draw up the plans for a new American government in the summer of 1787 in Philadelphia, in the same place where the Declaration of Independence had been written 11 years earlier. Declaring independence had been risky business, demanding ferocious courage that put lives and fortunes in jeopardy. But inventing a new government was no field day either, especially when it's summer and you're in scratchy suits and the windows are closed because you don't want anybody to hear what you are saying, and the air conditioning doesn't work because it won't be invented for nearly 200 years. And when you don't agree on things, it gets even hotter. For the framers, the question they argued over most while writing the Constitution and creating 3 branches of government had to do with the executive department. 1 man or 3 to do the job. How long should he serve? What would he really do? Who would pick him? How to get rid of him if he's doing a bad job or he's a crook? And of course, they all meant him, and he would be a white man. The idea of a woman, or an African American, for instance, holding this high office was not a glimmer in their eyes. But the framers knew they needed someone who could take charge, especially in a crisis like an invasion or a rebellion, or negotiating treaties. Congress was not very good at making such important decisions without debates and delays. But the framers thought America needed a man who was decisive and could act quickly. They called it energy and dispatch. One thing they were dead set against: there would be no king. They had fought a war against a country with a monarch and were afraid that one man with unchecked powers, in charge of an army, could take over the country. Instead, they settled on a president and laid out his powers in Article 2 of the Constitution. But who would choose him? Not the people. They were too liable to be misled, as one framer worried. Not the legislature. That would lead to cabal and factions. Electors, wise, informed men who had time to make a good decision. And if they didn't produce a winner, then the decision would go to one of the other branches of government, the Congress. The House of Representatives would step in and make the choice, which they did in 1801 and 1825. In the long, hot summer of 1787, compromises were made to invent the presidency, like counting slaves as 3/5 of a person, giving the president command of the army but Congress the power to declare war, and unlimited 4-year terms. Since then, some of those compromises have been amended, and the men in office have sometimes been too strong or too weak. But if you could start from scratch, how would you redesign the Oval Office?
People talk about the president like they're a superhero or supervillain, depending on the day. But the presidency isn't all powerful. We tend to expect presidents to fix everything, from potholes to pandemics. And then we act outraged when they can't. You see this in moments like Joe Exotic admonishing the president of the United States for not reforming a state-run institution. It's a perfect example of the perception gap between what the office was designed to do and what the public imagines it can do. The American presidency is really two roles. Presidents are both head of state and head of government. As head of state, they're the unifier, the ribbon cutter, the eulogist, the one throwing the first pitch at the baseball game. This is the role that speaks to the whole country, even when the country doesn't agree with itself. As head of government, they're the political fighter. They make budget choices and sign executive orders. They push legislation and they take sides. One person with two competing roles, a built-in contradiction. Now, the Constitution actually doesn't say a lot about this office. Article 2 gives us the structure of the presidency, but it's pretty short and vague. The founders spent way more time debating Congress, so this section feels more like a sketch than a full plan. Now, the language does lock in that presidents are chosen by the Electoral College. They must be a natural-born citizen, 35 years or older, and a U.S. resident for 14 years. They serve 4-year terms and are limited to 2 terms, thanks to the 22nd Amendment. In practice, presidents have executive, legislative, judicial, and administrative powers. But the exact shape and stretch of those powers are constantly being argued over. One thing is for certain. It's that presidential administrations have been known to test their limits. Presidential power shows up most clearly in the executive role, with military command and foreign policy. All of this falls under the idea of the president managing the federal government and leading in global affairs. The president appoints a cabinet. That's 15 executive departments plus the vice president. These folks are designed to be the machinery that keeps the government moving on presidential priorities. They are political appointments. As commander-in-chief, the president sits at the top of the military hierarchy. Congress has the power to declare war, but the president decides how and when that war gets fought. That tension is by design. Then there's foreign policy. The president negotiates treaties, represents the United States abroad, and steers the direction of global relationships. That power is shared by both the world stage and by what the Senate is willing to ratify. Now, the cabinet are the heads of the major departments, like state, defense, treasury, and the newest one, Homeland Security, which was created in 2003. Presidents rely on these leaders to execute policy, deliver briefings, and act as public and private advisors. The cabinet is often about political loyalty and reach. Each department touches a part of the American public. That's administrative power, scaled up. Beyond the cabinet, the president also leans on the Executive Office of the President, or EOP. This is the internal support structure that helps presidents with both political and policy decisions. You've got the Office of Management and Budget, the OMB, which oversees federal spending and signs off on regulations. This office is a big deal, and most Americans aren't aware it exists. You've got the Council on Economic Advisors, shaping the president's economic agenda, and the National Security Council, the NSC, offering foreign policy advice. These offices give the president a direct line to information, strategy, and control over the bureaucracy. It's how the president and the White House pushes an agenda across an entire federal system.
Agency heads will assess the hiring practices of the contractors that serve their organizations and report their findings to the Office of Management and Budget. It is only one of the dozens of functions OMB handles in administering the work of the federal government. Dan Chennick's executive director of the IBM Center for the Business of Government, former chief of the Information Policy and Technology branch at OMB, and he's a contributor to OMB, an insider's guide. Dan, welcome. Thanks for coming on. What do you think people who work in government, who should know this stuff, don't know about OMB and all of the things that it does to administer the work of the government?
Well, the book and the chapters written in the book were written by a team of leaders that ran different offices in OMB and are experts, having spent decades in the agency, kind of understanding perspectives and explaining those perspectives both to people in government and to new leaders coming into government. Three of the things that are important in terms of key findings from the book are the fact that OMB really provides objective analytical capacity and institutional memory for White Houses and White House staffs of both parties. It's really a government in miniature. Every agency, every function of government is represented in one building with a career staff of roughly 400 to 450 people, and then a political staff that comes in with each administration. The breadth of that reach really spans all aspects of policy, budgeting, and management. Importantly, if there is a change in administrations or even between terms of administration, OMB plays a very important role in terms of continuity for new leaders coming in during the transition and thereafter.
The White House staff don't need Senate confirmation. They're handpicked because they're fiercely loyal and usually have personal ties to the president himself. Since FDR, this team has ballooned from just 60 staffers to over 400. The chief of staff runs the show on the inside, managing operations, schedules, and access. White House staff run proximity. They're gatekeepers, messengers, and influencers.
There was so much news at the end of last week, we were unable to bring you our discussion with former White House Chiefs of Staff Dennis McDonough, who worked for President Obama, and Ken Duberstein from the Reagan White House. They, along with 15 others, are the subject of a new book by Chris Whipple called The Gatekeepers: How the White House Chiefs of Staff Every Presidency. We began by asking author Whipple why the job was so important.
Well, you know, it's critically important. One of the things I learned from talking to all the living White House chiefs is that presidents find out, often the hard way, that you cannot govern effectively without empowering a White House chief of staff as first among equals in the White House to, number one, to execute your agenda. Number two, tell you things that you don't want to hear. And modern history shows the wreckage of presidencies that did not understand that lesson.
Ken, what does the person a president picks to be their chief of staff say about a president?
You say an awful lot about a president because it's the person who he spends the most time with other than his wife. He's the person who you're trusted to tell you things that you don't want to hear, as Chris said. You're the reality therapist. Everybody walks into the Oval Office and gets tongue-tied. They tell the president what they think the president wants to hear, not what he needs to know. The chief of staff has to tell him what he needs to know.
Ken, when you're chief of staff, do you kind of always have the president inside your head? Is that a part of the job? Or knowing the president's instincts, do you have to kind of intuit where the person is going, who is the president?
Absolutely. You get to know the man. You get to know where he's going, what his goals are, what's acceptable. You know, on Reagan's case, he always would take 80% of what he wanted. Tip O'Neill used to say, I don't like compromising with Reagan because Reagan gets 80% of what he wants. And Reagan would turn to Jim Baker and to me and others and say, I'll take 80% every time, and I'll come back the next year for the additional 20. That's what governing is all about. Reagan understood that the far right and the far left, as he used to remind us, are professional bitchers. They don't want to be satisfied. That's how they get their money. That's how they get their members. So get what you can. Get that 80%. Figure out how to build a coalition that gets you that, and then keep moving. And don't worry about the far left or the far right.
Dennis, you did something with President Obama called the wrap, the walk at the end of the day. What was that about, and what were those conversations like?
We used to just sit in the Oval and just go over what happened during the day and then what was teed up for the next day. I think it was kind of a nice springtime like this in D.C. He said, let's walk. And so, you know, sometimes the walk would be one lap. Sometimes it would be many more than one. Sometimes we'd be joined by others. But the point was to just have one moment to try to stop, get out of the kind of the rigmarole of the day and take a look ahead at what more we needed to do, what more we had hanging over for the next day.
Chris, the chief of staff is so powerful that does it ever come to be the case that they become a little too powerful for the president's own liking? Certainly that's been President Trump has talked about Steve Bannon. Now, Steve Bannon is not the chief of staff, but there's been reporting about some tension between the president, seeing Steve Bannon as the man behind the throne. Is this a problem or potential problem?
Well, it's certainly been a problem with some White House chiefs. The far greater problem, in my mind, is when no one seems to be in charge, which may sound familiar at the moment. When you have 8 or 9 senior advisors, or even 4 or 5 with equal access to the Oval, no one is a gatekeeper, no one is in charge of the information flow, no one is in charge of executing policy, then you have what Jerry Ford used to call the spokes of the wheel, where nobody's in charge. It took Jerry Ford about a month to figure out that was a disaster.
Ken, in the current administration, you have a chief of staff, you have Steve Bannon, an advisor to the president who's quite powerful. Then you have the president's daughter, who also has an important role. And then you have the president's son-in-law. That's at least 4 people with, I don't know whether you want to call it walk into the Oval Office privileges or seems to be on the same kind of power level. How do you evaluate that power structure in terms of the job that a chief of staff has to get done?
Well, going back to Chris's comment, the president needs to empower one person to be the White House chief of staff and the funnel rather than the spokes of the wheel. The person, and it's Reince Priebus, who has to be designated as first among equals. He is the person who may be the partner. There may be a partnership at the White House with lots of people, but he's the senior partner.
You know, Dick Cheney once told me that you can't have 8 or 9 guys sitting around with a very tough issue that you have to take to the president.
As Bill Clinton found out.
Saying, hey, it's your turn to tell him. No, it's your turn it's your turn to tell him. Somebody's got to be the guy who goes in with a piece of bad news.
You can have all the discussion you want, but then the door closes in the Oval Office and it's you and the president. You're the one who has to deliver that message. It ain't going to fly.
What's the worst message you had to deliver?
Oh, there are lots of them.
Dennis, how about you? Any that you felt like there was a gulp before you?
There's these things all the time. The worst was walking down the hallway to tell them that healthcare.gov wasn't going to work.
Yeah.
And it was particularly bad because he spent the entire previous year in monthly, then biweekly, then weekly meetings, concluding them by saying, now everybody understands that this only works if the website works, right? And everybody said, yeah, absolutely, Mr. President. So, yeah, that was preceded by a gulp.
Yeah, but you do that every day.
Yeah.
There's always something.
Skill set, Chris. We've talked about it, the ability to say no, the ability to set up a system. What else does a chief of staff need?
I don't know if you guys would agree, but I think temperament is a huge part of it. I think when you look at our present company, but especially at James Baker or Leon Panetta, these are grounded, sensible people who are comfortable in their own skin, who are not afraid to talk to the president and tell him what he needs to know. I think that's maybe an underrated thing. You know, they said about Leon Panetta that he was an iron fist inside a velvet glove. You don't have to be the pluperfect son of a bitch, as Haldeman was called. You can do it nicely as long as you enforce what you're trying to do.
And we'll be right back.
Presidents don't pass laws, but they can issue executive orders. These are directives that have the force of law within the executive branch. There's no need for Congress, just the president's signature. But, and there's a big but, they're not permanent. The next president can undo them.
On January 1st, 1863, Abraham Lincoln legally changed the status of over 3 million enslaved blacks across 10 states from slave to free. His Emancipation Proclamation wasn't a law or a presidential decree. It was an executive order. The framers of the American Constitution made the power of the executive order available to the executive branch. But what exactly is this tool? How does it work? And what is the extent of its power? Well, an executive order isn't a law, but it can carry the weight of one. Passing laws involves a fairly lengthy process. First, a member of Congress proposes a piece of legislation in the form of a bill. After many committees and revisions, if the bill is approved by a majority of votes in Congress, that is, both the House and Senate, the bill is then sent to the President for signature. If the President signs the bill, it then becomes a law. An executive order, on the other hand, is something the President issues without consultation or permission from Congress. They are, however, enforced like laws and are subject to judicial review by the court system to make sure they're within the limits of the Constitution. That means the courts have the power to invalidate any executive decisions that they determine are an overreach of the President in trying to assert power. And once the President leaves office, if his or her successor wants to eliminate the executive order, they can do so. So when does a president use an executive order? Sometimes a president feels the need to exert power without working with Congress, and in times of crisis, quick decisions can be justified. But most executive orders are not responses to emergencies. They're often directed towards agencies in the federal government in order to expand or contract their power. Others determine the extent to which legislation should be enforced. And sometimes, a president may use an executive order to clarify and help implement a policy that needs to be easily defined. Some of the most famous executive orders have changed the course of American history. FDR issued an executive order to establish the Works Progress Administration, which helped build thousands of roads, bridges, and parks throughout the country. The WPA also employed thousands of writers, painters, sculptors, and artists to create works of art in public spaces. Additionally, Harry Truman used an executive order to desegregate the armed forces in 1948. And in 1965, Lyndon Johnson signed an executive order to establish requirements for non-discriminatory practices in hiring and employment. Executive orders have often been used in positive and inclusive ways, but they've also been used to exclude and divide. One of the most notable examples being FDR's 1942 executive order. He gave the military authority to target predominantly Japanese Americans, as well as German Americans and Italian Americans in certain regions across the country. This executive order also removed any or all of those people into military zones, most commonly known as internment camps. Beginning in the early 1960s, each president has issued roughly 300 executive orders, but FDR issued over 3,500. At the other end of the spectrum, William Henry Harrison never issued an executive order, probably because his presidency only lasted 31 days. The U.S. Constitution is somewhat ambiguous on the extent of the president's power. That's resulted in executive orders expanding over time. For instance, since Lyndon Johnson, presidents have begun issuing orders to create faith-based initiatives, establish federal agencies, and remove barriers for scientific research. There are checks and balances in the U.S. political system. Congress can pass laws to counteract executive orders, and judges can halt them by deeming them unconstitutional. But in the time it takes for those things to happen, an executive order can go into effect and possibly change the course of history, for better or for worse.
Emergency powers lets presidents act fast and sometimes aggressively. President Trump leaned heavily on these during his first 100 days of his second term, especially around immigration and border security. By declaring a national emergency, he was able to redirect military funds and bypass Congress entirely. These powers are debatably legal because they stretch the bounds of what some interpret as reasonable. They're a good reminder that how a president interprets their authority is often as important as what the Constitution says. Executive orders aren't new. Lincoln suspended habeas corpus during the Civil War. FDR ordered mass internment during World War II. Barack Obama created protections for undocumented youth through the DACA program. What unites them is that they all bypass Congress in the name of urgency, necessity, or political gridlock. That is executive power in action, sharp, fast, and quite often controversial. Shifting gears to the president's legislative powers. A president doesn't do lawmaking directly, but has the power to influence, shape, and stall the legislative process. The Constitution says the president shall from time to time give to the Congress information of the State of the Union. Today, that's a major annual political event called the State of the Union Address. It's the president's blueprint for the year, a list of demands, and a chance to set the national agenda. Presidents can also call Congress into special session, a rare but constitutionally granted power that allows the executive to force legislative attention when urgency demands it. But the real influence comes from bargaining, personal meetings, public pressure, and political leverage. Presidents also have a lasting effect on the courts, nominate federal judges, including Supreme Court justices, and these appointments are for life. Through these nominations, a president can shape the judicial branch for decades. The Solicitor General, often called the 10th Justice, is another key player. Appointed by the president, this person argues on behalf of the United States government before the Supreme Court. That means that the president gets a say, indirectly, in how laws are interpreted and tested.
Presidential pardons are usually news at the end of a presidency, when someone on their way out of the White House is a little less afraid of controversy. But President Trump started using his presidential pardon power the first summer he was in office, and he's continued to use his presidential pardon power for a variety of controversial figures, all the while claiming that his power to pardon is absolute. So, is it? Well, frankly, it's pretty darn powerful. Our Constitution is broadly based on a system of checks and balances, but the power to pardon is something of an anomaly. That's because there is no judicial review and no chance for Congress to intervene. It was actually something that European monarchs, who were supposed to be ruling by divine right, liked to do. Way back in 1717, King George I of England offered a full pardon to any pirate who would surrender. He even offered to let them keep their loot. Now, that divine right of kings was none too popular in colonial America, but some of the founding fathers thought the pardon power would be worth importing. Others, of course, feared that the power to pardon would lead to endless political favors, and pardoning treason could lead to tyranny. Enter Alexander Hamilton, stage right, star of his own Broadway show, and big believer in a strong federal government. He saw the pardon power as a useful political tool, and he wrote, "In seasons of insurrection or rebellion, there are often critical moments when a well-timed offer of pardon to the insurgents or rebels may restore the tranquility of the Commonwealth." Though Hamilton won on that one, and the power to pardon was enshrined in the Constitution in these few words: "The President shall have power to grant reprieves and pardons for offenses against the United States, except in cases of impeachment." So, the President could pardon any federal crime, even if it hadn't been charged yet, but could not pardon for crimes prosecuted by the states. Early presidents seemed mindful of concerns about this unchecked power, mostly using it to ease tensions in times of national crisis. George Washington's only pardons were for a group of Pennsylvania farmers who had joined in the Whiskey Rebellion. That was an uprising in 1794 protesting federal taxes on distilled spirits. John Adams pardoned another group of fractious farmers from Pennsylvania. These were following a guy named John Fries in a uprising against taxes in 1799 and 1800. Later on, President Andrew Johnson would pardon the whole Confederate Army after the Civil War, And much later, President Jimmy Carter would pardon all those who violated the draft laws during the Vietnam War. And by far the most famous presidential pardon was granted by one president to another.
And by these presents do grant a full, free, and absolute pardon unto Richard Nixon.
Which brings us to the question of a presidential self-pardon. Now, it's never happened, and while it's not a universal opinion, most legal scholars think the Constitution does not permit it. In fact, in the 1970s, the Justice Department wrote that the president could not self-pardon because no person can serve as the judge on his or her own case. And there could be other ways that the presidential pardon power is ultimately limited. Legal scholars, such as Cass Sunstein, have argued that if President Trump were to use his pardon power to, quote, shelter the people, unquote, who were involved in crimes the president himself might have been involved in, that would be an impeachable offense. This has been an open question we have not had to resolve yet. But increasingly, it seems that our current administration may take actions that would push the issue of the president's pardon power to the Supreme Court, where, ultimately, we would expect to get clarity about the presidential pardon power. So for now, I'm Ron Elving at NPR. Thank you for coming to my office hours.
Finally, we've got the biggest check on presidential power: impeachment. Article 2, Section 4 of the Constitution lays it out clearly. The president, vice president, and other civil officers can be removed for treason, bribery, or other high crimes and misdemeanors. But what counts as a high crime is where the political shenanigans begin. The House of Representatives votes to impeach. It's like an indictment. Then the Senate holds a trial. Conviction requires a 2/3 vote. It's rare and it's dramatic, but it's part of the system by design. We've seen it used multiple times in recent history. Nixon resigned before it could happen. Clinton was impeached, but acquitted. Trump was impeached twice and acquitted twice. But I bet you already knew that.
Impeaching a president potentially occurs when there's treason, bribery, or other high crimes or misdemeanors. The process for this is, first, the House votes on and presents something called the Articles of Impeachment under Article 1, Section 2 of the Constitution. If that vote passes, then the Senate actually holds a trial specific to removing the president from office or not, and must vote a 2/3 vote to do so. Then after that, the president could potentially be subject to other liability.
We need to take a step back and look at how presidential power has expanded over time. The Constitution barely sketches the job. Most of what we associate with modern presidential power came later, through war, economic crisis, and a public that demands immediate results. Richard Neustadt argued that presidential power is the power to persuade. In the 19th and early 20th century, presidents were mostly passive. They carried out the will of Congress and didn't pretend otherwise. Presidents like Harding and Coolidge and Hoover, they weren't transformational leaders, in part because that just wasn't widely expected of the presidency. But the modern presidency changed all of that. After FDR, the expectation was to do something about everything. Neustadt said successful presidents are both commanders and bargainers. They convince others that it's in their best interests to go along. Brownlow Committee in 1936 famously declared the president needs help. That launched what we now call the institutional presidency, with massive staff, advisors, and executive offices. Today, the White House is complex machinery, where persuasion is key. FDR, Lyndon Johnson, Ronald Reagan, they succeeded because they knew how to work the levers of power without pulling too hard. Each surmounted harsh political odds because they were able to communicate to the public, to policymakers, and/or to the media. Stephen Skowronek gives us another lens, political time. He argues that presidential effectiveness is about more than personality. It's about timing. Where a president lands in political time determines how much change is possible. Reconstructive presidents come to power when old regimes are collapsing. They reset the political landscape. Think FDR, think Ronald Reagan. They built new coalitions from the ground up.
Our greatest primary task is to put people to work.
In 1933, newly elected Franklin Delano Roosevelt confronted 25% unemployment, the collapse of banking, and sweeping poverty. His response would reshape the way the country thought about itself, its president, and democracy.
The United States was in the fetal position, and people really wondered whether we would ever get out of this.
Jonathan Alter is author of The Defining Moment, FDR's 100 Days and the Triumph of Hope. We spoke inside the Manhattan home where Roosevelt slept the night he learned that he had won the presidency.
Roosevelt believed in what he called action and action now.
This nation is asking for action and action now.
And he used that word in his inaugural address 6 times. It actually got more applause than the only thing we have to fear is fear itself.
While Roosevelt was ready for action, he had to make sure the country was too. At a time when the tenets of democracy itself were being questioned, he recast the social contract, convincing the American public they were all in it together.
What is the New Deal? It's a deal between the government and the people on what they expect of one another. And before Roosevelt was president, it was basically every man for himself, rugged individualism.
The only real contact the American people had with the federal government was when they went to the post office to buy a stamp. Roosevelt changed all of that.
He changed it by offering information and hope, says professor and historian David Woolner at the Roosevelt family estate in Hyde Park, New York.
People would gather around their radios and they would listen to their president explain what the government was trying to do. And this was very, very reassuring.
The famous fireside chats were few in number, but were symbolic of a connection between the patrician Roosevelt and those suffering with poverty. Something the president understood because he had suffered, says Susan Dunn, a Roosevelt scholar at Williams College.
I would say that the symbol of his presidency, of his life, is Warm Springs, Georgia.
Roosevelt was stricken with polio in 1921. He never walked again. During his recovery, he built a facility in Warm Springs, Georgia for other polio sufferers and took charge of its operation.
And it helped him to relate to all kinds of people. It's leading a life of kindness, of respect, of responsibility for the people we know, as well as for the people we don't know. That's what a real democracy requires. That's the moral basis of democracy.
With the country's support for his spirit of experimentation, Roosevelt unleashed a flock of programs.
They went to work building the infrastructure of this country in ways that are almost unimaginable now. They built 39,000 schools, 2,500 hospitals, more than 300 airports, 800 state parks.
The Hoover Dam, the Lincoln Tunnel, the Tennessee Valley Authority, among the many major projects created with a Congress willing to work with the president. That didn't mean Roosevelt was without enemies.
I think there's a kind of an assumption that everything for him worked, but he had very, very strong opposition. There was plenty of partisanship, and there were plenty of Republicans and some Democrats who thought that he was becoming a dictator.
Soon enough, Roosevelt would be fighting real dictators in the Second World War, which ultimately lifted the country out of the Depression. America became a beacon for the world, and its leader, Roosevelt, offered a new way to measure the worth of a nation.
And he said, the test of our progress is not whether we provide much to those who have much, but whether we provide enough to those who have too little.
That is the test posed by FDR for America's leaders today. Not just to survive, but to plot a course for a way to emerge from this crisis stronger.
These presidents inherit a strong regime and work to sustain it. They tweak, adjust, maybe frustrate their own base, but they mostly stick to the dominant script. I'm thinking Dwight Eisenhower or George H.W. Bush. They fall into this category.
The previous 6 years, George Bush has been ambassador to the United Nations, chairman of the Republican National Committee, our envoy to China, and the director of Central Intelligence. He was conservative, but not in the Reagan sense. He said that Reagan's idea that you could cut taxes and therefore eliminate the deficit was voodoo economics. So Bush was in a way out of sync with where the party was headed. The vice presidency was a second prize, but it was a highly sought after second prize for Bush. He thought it would give him the platform to eventually run for president. And the Reagan-Bush working relationship was a model of how a president and vice president should work together. And in the summer of 1988, Bush was the putative heir to Ronald Reagan, but the right wing of the party was deeply skeptical. They wanted absolute assurance that he was one of them. Taxes remained an open question for him. And so, at the advice of a lot of folks, including Roger Ailes, Bush decided that he had to be absolutely clear that he would not raise taxes.
Read my lips. No, you.
He says, good question about who believed Bush's pledge. Deficits had been rising under President Reagan. Federal spending itself had been rising. The base, I think, talks itself into believing that no new taxes was a reality. Bush was an economics graduate from Yale, so he knew that the budget was not balancing. He suspected that he would have to break that pledge. But one of the things about President Bush was while he would say a lot of things to get power, he believed that what he should be ultimately judged on was what he did once he had power. George Bush became president at a particularly vital moment in the global story. Communism is ending around the world. Mandela is released from prison. There's just a remarkable sense that liberal democracy was going to be on the march forever. For Bush, he had a much more practical issue.
Welcome the new whip of the House, Newt Gingrich, and looking forward to working with you.
Bush saw sound governance as the art of compromise. To Gingrich and his allies, victory was the central goal, more so in many ways than the fiscal health of the country. This rising Republican force saw politics as total warfare. And those two forces met in conflict in the early summer of 1990 over the question of whether taxes should be raised to try to control the federal deficit. Bush was caught between implacable forces. He knew that the Republicans were going to kill him, but he still had this old-fashioned sense that he was their president. Maybe they would recognize his sound governance as opposed to their idealism. And he decided to break the pledge in exchange for rules that would control the deficit going forward. The mistake came when he failed to explain that deal. Bush's apologies on the Read My Lips were always kind of murky and ambivalent. He basically apologized for having said it, not having broken the promise. The base exploded. The base went crazy because they were saying, see, we told you. This guy couldn't be trusted.
Then you've got presidents who try to govern against the dominant coalition. They're disruptive, sometimes in ways that excite, other times in ways that alienate. They often rely on executive tools to push policy through. Think Richard Nixon, think Bill Clinton.
We know big government does not have all the answers. We know there's not a program for every problem. We know, and we have worked to give the American people a smaller, less bureaucratic government in Washington. And we have to give the American people one that lives within its means. The era of big government is over.
Disjunctive presidents inherit exhausted regimes. They're stuck defending old ideas in a new era. Their coalitions are weak, their policies are seen as out of touch, and their presidencies often end in crisis. You could look at Jimmy Carter and arguably George W. Bush to fit this mold.
Jimmy Carter gave his famous malaise speech. He never used that term, but that's the name that was given to a speech in which the president said the country's economic woes were due in part to a crisis of confidence in the country. It has come to be known as perhaps the most politically tone-deaf speech in modern American history. Take a look.
It is a crisis of confidence. It is a crisis that strikes at the very heart and soul and spirit of our national will. We can see this crisis in the growing doubt about the meaning of our own lives and in the loss of a unity of purpose for our nation. The erosion of our confidence in the future is threatening to destroy the social and the political fabric of America. The confidence that we have always had as a people is not simply some romantic dream or a proverb in a dusty book that we read just on the 4th of July. It is the idea which founded our nation and has guided our development as a people. Confidence in the future has supported everything else. Public institutions and private enterprise, our own families, and the very Constitution of the United States. Confidence has defined our course.
Presidential popularity is ultimately about leverage and political capital. When a president's approval is high, members of Congress are more likely to fall in line. When it tanks, even allies start distancing themselves. Approval ratings rise in moments of national unity. Think post 9/11 for George W. Bush. But they crash when the public feels ignored, misled, or betrayed. And the higher the expectations, the harder the fall. Modern presidents live and die by the polls. Popularity is currency. Without it, the White House goes bankrupt on influence. Now, the honeymoon period is that brief political window right after a president is elected, when optimism is high and Congress is more cooperative. It's when the president has the best chance to get bold legislation through. But it fades fast. Presidents get too much credit when the economy soars and too much blame when it stumbles. They're expected to control forces way beyond their grasp, like interest rates, global supply chains, market volatility. But perception matters more than precision. And modern presidents use media the way marketers use ad campaigns. Rally events are choreographed for optics with patriotic backdrops, diverse supporters, catchy slogans. It's about shaping narrative, looking decisive and building momentum. These aren't town halls that you're seeing. They're political theater designed to boost approval and reframe controversy. Again, it's about maintaining popularity. When crisis hits, especially military threats, Americans tend to rally around the president. This boost in approval is often short-lived, but politically powerful. You can look no further than George W. Bush after 9/11 or his father, George H.W. Bush, during the Gulf War. The idea of going public changed the game. Presidents used to bargain behind closed doors. Now they take their case directly to the people with press conferences and social media, primetime speeches and rallies. They do it because it works. It puts pressure on Congress and gives the illusion of accountability. But it also turns governing into 24/7 campaigning. Every president has an image. Clinton was the empathetic policy wonk. Obama was intellect and cool. Trump, the combative outsider. Image is branding, and it shapes how people interpret events. A president who looks strong can survive a scandal. A president who looks weak can lose support after a success. It ain't fair. It's just how the office works now. The modern presidency is a paradox where it's centralized yet chaotic, powerful yet constrained. Expectations are sky high, and institutional tools have not kept up. Presidents are expected to fix the economy, solve cultural divides, win wars, and unite a country. The task is one of myth-making.
Good evening. We have concluded that our government must be reorganized to deal more effectively with the new threats of the 21st century. So tonight, I ask the Congress to join me in creating a single permanent department with an overriding and urgent mission, securing the homeland of America and protecting the American people. I do not believe anyone could have prevented the horror of September the 11th. Yet we now know that thousands of trained killers are plotting to attack us, and this terrible knowledge requires us to act differently. If you're a frontline worker for the FBI, the CIA, some other law enforcement or intelligence agency, and you see something that raises suspicions, I want you to report it immediately. America is leading the civilized world in a titanic struggle against terror. Freedom and fear are at war, and freedom is winning. Every day I review a document called the Threat Assessment. It summarizes what our intelligence services and key law enforcement agencies have picked up about terrorist activity. Sometimes the information is very general, vague talk, bragging about future attacks. Sometimes the information is more specific, as in a recent case when an al-Qaeda detainee said attacks were planned against financial institutions. When credible intelligence warrants, appropriate law enforcement and local officials are alerted. These warnings are unfortunately a new reality in American life, and we have recently seen an increase in the volume of general threats. History has called our nation into action. History has placed a great challenge before us. Will America, with our unique position and power, blink in the face of terror? Or will we lead to a freer, more civilized world? There is only one answer. This great country will lead the world to safety, security, peace, and freedom. Thank you for listening. Good night, and may God bless America.
Now, succession is kind of important too, no? If the president dies, resigns, or is removed, the Presidential Succession Act of 1947 lays out the order of replacement, from vice president to Speaker of the House to a long list of cabinet officials. Oh, and every State of the Union address has a designated survivor, because everyone is in that room. So someone is kept far away just in case the worst happens.
The vice presidency is mostly a symbolic job. However, the vice presidency is also defined by president. Now, maybe I can handle some of the more mundane jobs, overseeing a bureaucracy, managing military, energy, foreign policy.
That sounds good.
Originally, vice presidents were simply the runner-up in the Electoral College, but the 12th Amendment changed that. Still, the role has always been somewhat of an afterthought. As one Veep famously said, the job wasn't worth a warm pitcher of spit. Today, it depends entirely on the president. Some vice presidents are powerful advisors. Others are ceremonial seat fillers. But when things go wrong, remember, they're next in line.
The vice presidency used to look dramatically different than it does today. Officially, the Constitution assigned the VP only 2 jobs. The first, presiding over the Senate, where the vice president cast tie-breaking votes. The second, taking over the president's duties in the event of disability, death, or resignation. In fact, VPs originally had so few formal responsibilities that a member of the first U.S. Congress thought they should be compensated on a per diem basis. As a result, most early vice presidents found themselves at loose ends. In fact, John Adams, the country's first VP, called the vice presidency the most insignificant office that ever the invention of man contrived. It wasn't until the 20th century that the job became something greater. Warren Harding was the first president to invite his VP, Calvin Coolidge, to attend cabinet meetings, a practice FDR continued with all 3 of his vice presidents. Still, President Roosevelt's last VP, Harry Truman, felt completely unprepared to assume the presidency when FDR died. For one thing, Truman had been kept totally in the dark about the Manhattan Project, the top-secret effort to create an atomic bomb. To prevent something similar from happening, Truman convinced Congress to add the vice president to the National Security Council. The next president in line, Dwight Eisenhower, also wanted to make sure his potential successor, Richard Nixon, was intimately involved in domestic and foreign policy. Vice President Nixon was invited to attend briefings alongside Ike, met with dozens of foreign leaders on his behalf, and worked on important civil rights legislation. But the biggest shift in the vice presidency came when Walter Mondale assumed the office. President Jimmy Carter treated his VP as a full partner, giving him unprecedented equal access to classified materials and meetings sometimes for hours daily to discuss important developments. Mondale was also given symbolic evidence of the role's increased importance, a permanent office in the White House for the first time ever. While every partnership is different, the Carter-Mondale model became a template for how future presidents and vice presidents work together, paving the way for VPs to be fully involved in the executive branch and transforming the vice presidency into an office of significance. To learn more, watch The American Vice President.
The American presidency is forged in contradiction, built to act decisively, but constrained at every turn, expected to lead the nation, yet forced to negotiate every inch of authority. From the Constitution's minimalist sketch to the full spectacle of modern media, the office has evolved through wars and crises and public demands into something far bigger and far blurrier than the framers envisioned. It is both stage and seat of power, both a lightning rod for blame and a symbol of national resolve. This office is both powerful and boxed in by structure, by politics, and by our own expectation. That's the presidency. That's power. by design.